Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about chapter 7 about thinking and language. Specifically, in this video, we'll talk about module 7.1 thinking. So, before we talk about thinking, a quick background information. If you remember from the history of psychology, we talked about how cognitive psychology is different from other fields and how it is the main, prominent, basic, fundamental perspective of studying human mind and human behavior. Cognitive psychologists specifically study the internal behavior, the mental processes related to thinking, language, production, problem solving, reasoning, um, and and how we acquire these knowledge. So there are some basic fundamental aspects of cognitive psychology's assumptions that go under this particular topic. If you remember from the earlier videos, we said that cognitive psychology has three fundamental assumptions. Number one, that mental processes exist. Number two, that we can study mental processes objectively. And number three, that humans are information processing systems. So this unit is basically talking about two such mental processes. One is thinking in 7.1, and the other one is how we use language, which would be in 7.2. So let's get started with 7.1, thinking. So what is thinking? Well, you might be thinking right now about what thinking might be. Thinking is defined as a mental process of representation and manipulation of information. Representation and manipulation of information. Now, before we talk about the specifics of the definition of thinking, it's important that we understand the historical underpinnings behind the cognitive psychology and the fundamental ideas behind defining thinking. Now, it all goes back to scientist Alan Turing. If you watch the game, if you watch the movie, The Enigma, it's not Enigma. I think it's called the Imitation Game, which is about the machine called Enigma. It's the same Alan Turing. The idea here is that any system, if it acts intelligently, and system here includes humans, any system, if it acts intelligently, it acts so because it does two unique things. And these two unique things are that it represents information about the external world in the form of symbols, and that it can actually manipulate symbols. Now, let's talk about symbols in this slide. In the next slide, we'll talk about manipulation of symbols. Now, what is a symbol? A symbol is a representation of the object in the real world. For example, the symbol for, let's say, a coffee mug, which is an object in the real world. All right, let's assume, I know it's not a coffee mug. Let's assume it's like a coffee mug. So this is the actual coffee mug in the real world, and we represent that with this symbol that sounds mug or coffee mug. A symbol is something, a representation of the actual thing in the real world. Now, the important thing that makes a symbol is the connection between the actual object in the real world and its symbol that we use to represent it, which is completely arbitrary. In other words, the world will not change if we start calling a coffee mug a chalk and a chalk a coffee mug. Well, I hope you're having a nice coffee in that chalk. Well, it sounds odd, but it does not change the world. You can still continue to communicate. So, what makes symbols is this idea that they represent objects in the real world or ideas in the real world, and there is no real connection between them. And this particular thing is what makes a symbol. So going back to the intelligence, and as we said that a system is intelligent if it can store symbols and if it can manipulate symbols. So computers are intelligent because they store symbols and they can manipulate symbols. So also humans, we also store symbols and we manipulate symbols. Well, thinking then is, if you go back to the original definition we started with, is the mental representations and the manipulation of those representations. It is how we develop representations of the objects and ideas in the real world, and how we manipulate these will make up thinking. In this particular video, we'll talk about thinking as representations. In the next video, we'll talk about thinking as manipulation. Remember, what we're saying here is that thinking involves manipulating the representations or manipulating the symbols we have in our mind. So we need to know what these symbols are. In other words, what these representations are first before we can talk about the process we use to manipulate this representation. So that's why I've divided this a particular topic of 7.1 thinking into two videos. 7.1 about the nature of the representations or symbols, and 7.2 is about how we manipulate these representations. So coming to the representations. Now, how do we represent the information? In other words, how do we represent the objects or ideas in the real world in our mind? Well, there are, according to the scientists, there are two different ways we can represent information or objects or ideas in the real world. One is in the form of pictures or images. It's called mental images. The other is more abstract in the form of words or concepts. A very, very fundamental distinction between these two at a very basic level is that one is pictorial, more like analog. The other one is more digital in the world, in the sense that there is no real um, representation of it in a pictorial format. So it's pictorial and non-pictorial, or mental images and words or concepts. So first we'll talk about pictorial representations, then we'll talk about the non-pictorial representations. So coming to the pictorial representation, the images. Now, what is an image? Well, an image is a picture or a sensory representation of an object or an event in the real world. So when I say apple, well, did you figure an apple, an image of an apple, in your mind? Well, that is an image, right? So an image is a mental picture, a sensory representation, a sensory symbol of the actual object or event in the real world. Now, keep in mind that the system that stores this information it stores in a way that you can actually manipulate these images. Now you can think of, close your eyes and think of I don't know, like think of a kite and maybe flying it, or maybe pulling it down from the sky, and maybe twisting it, or breaking it, or rotating it. Well, you can, with the pictorial images, manipulate that visually or pictorially. Now, I say pictorially here, picture here, or pictorial here does not necessarily represent visual. It can, it is not limited to visual images. It can be related to auditory, any sense organ. It can be gustatory. It can be tactile. It can be related to smells, touch, related to five different sense organs. So the idea here is that it is in a sensory format. It's a sensory representation of an object or even in the real world. um, and sometimes this can lead to solving some problems, creative solutions, coming with nice new novel solutions to finding problems. Again, we'll talk about this in the next video when we talk about problem solving and manipulation. Now, one important thing about these images, whether it's visual or any other format, and more particularly more related to the pictorial one, the visual ones, is that we can manipulate, right? Under this idea of mental rotation, and according to this, we can mentally imagine an object, and you can mentally rotate an object. And researchers have found that we take same amount of time, or at like approximately same amount of time, to physically rotate an object. Um, um, Same amount if we were to mentally rotate the object. What researchers did in one of these experiments is they presented participants with pairs of images like this, and the task was to decide if these two objects of a given pair are same or different. Now, especially now for these are different, these are same, and for the object that are same, what they manipulated was how much of a rotation, angle of rotation there is between the original object, the first object, and the second object, whether it was small or it was more. In other words, um, an individual need to compare um, two objects with a different orientation, with a lot of rotation required to compare versus a small amount of rotation to be compared. What researchers found was that participants took longer time if the angle of rotation between the two objects was more, when compared to when there was a smaller angle of rotation between the objects. In fact, it was in line with the actual time taken to mentally rotate an object, suggesting that we use pictorial, or at least visual representations, in a way that we actually this is called embodied cognition. We use it in a way that it is in real time. Now, coming to the second way we can represent objects or events in the real world, the non-pictorial format, the words or concepts. So, what is a concept? Concept is a mental category of class of objects that we have formed. So, for example, when I say dog, it's not only the dog that you have at home with you right now, but it also includes any dogs there are. Does it make sense? So if I show you a new dog that you haven't met ever in your life, and ask you what it is, you would still say it's a dog. But the fact is that you've never met this dog before. The idea here is that we have concepts for these different objects. We have concepts for apples. We have concepts for dogs. We have concepts for even non-concrete objects, ideas like love, freedom, struggle. And what these concepts are our mental category of things. And we have these categories by grouping objects or events or ideas that share some commonality between them. Um, And why do we do that? Why do we have concept for apple or all the objects that we experience in the real world? Well, it helps us to classify object in the real world. In other words, when you see a new apple, the one that definitely you haven't seen ever in your life, but still you end up saying it's an apple, because it saves your time. Otherwise, each object that you experience would be unique one in one or the other way, and you end up spending your entire life deciding what it is because you don't have a symbol for that. So, a concept is that symbol representation that represents um, um, all such objects that fall into one specific category. So, it's a mental category of things. It helps us classify object, which is basically perception, and and it will allow us to quickly identify or quickly perceive what that object is, which eventually will help us, whether it's a threatening or non-threatening, and that is very important to the survival. So, what concepts do is help us. When you see a new dog, you would say it's an instance of a bigger category of dogs. So you can move on with perceiving new objects. Well, there are two types of concepts. There are logical concepts and there are natural concepts. We'll talk about each one of these. Before that, let me ask you a question. You all know what a cauliflower is. Now, what is a cauliflower? Is it a flower or a vegetable? Well, think about it. You can pause the video and then have an answer in your mind and resume the video. Did you say vegetable? Well, is it a vegetable? It's actually, technically, logically speaking, it is an inflorescence. An inflorescence is a collection of flowers. In that sense, it's more closer to a flower than being a vegetable. So there are two types of concepts, logical and natural, and we'll talk about each one of these here. For instance, logical concepts. A logical concept has clear defined rules for category membership. In other words, this is either a triangle or not a triangle. And the rules are not fuzzy, very clear. A triangle has three sides, three angles, and it's a closed structure. Right? So logical concepts are very clear rules of membership. The natural concepts, on the other hand, are poorly defined. Mostly, the concepts we use in everyday life are more likely to be natural concepts. For example, I say, what is coconut? Is it a nut, a vegetable, a fruit? Well, it's actually a drupe. A drupe is a fibrous fruit with a hard covering. Well, anyways, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that the way we use an app, the way you use the representation of an object may have real rules, then it's a logical concept, or it may have fuzzy rules, then it is a natural concept. All abstract concepts, or most of the abstract concepts, are natural concepts. The rules are not really clear. But there are some objects which have both kinds of concepts, like you have fruits, right? Um, and the the logical definition of it and the way we use it might be slightly different. And non-experts use it in a natural way, but experts would use it in a logical way. So if you ask a biologist or a botanist what a cauliflower is, he's more likely to say that it is an inflorescence. But if you ask a commoner, a non-expert, he would say it's a vegetable. So some objects have these both representations, and we use in different ways depending on our expertise or background knowledge. Now, interesting question is that how do we form these concepts? Now, keep in mind that when you say form concepts, there are two things here. First of all, how do we develop these concepts? Then how do we make judgments about the category membership later on? Well, as kids, we learn to form concepts through our experiences, and we'll talk about them in the next slide. But the decisions we make about whether a new object is a part of that category or not is based on the judgments of probability. How likely is that this object is a member of this particular category than the other? So it's the likelihood that an object is a member of a category. Once you have the category, though, and these likelihood decisions may be based on different factors. It could be related to um, by comparing the new object to the best example of the object you have in your mind, or it can compare it to the probabilistic nature of all the features that it may have specific to a concept, or it can be based on one unique example. So there are different theories on how we make category judgments. But an important question, though, is this is after forming concepts, right? The question is, how do we form the concepts in the first place? Well, we form concepts as children. We learn concepts, we refine concepts, and then we fine tune concepts. And this comes with the experience and with the feedback we get from our parents and elders and the environment around us. So I have a 6-year old, and when she was little, everything that had hair was a dog. Well, then she just had a category of hairy things that would be a dog. But later on, she could distinguish between a cat and a dog because of the positive and negative instances or experiences she had with us in telling, no, 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 that's not a dog. Everything that has hair is not bow wow. It could be something else. It can also be a meow meow. So we learn these concepts through positive and negative instances. Coming to the way concepts are organized. Now, concepts are organized hierarchically. So let's say you have concept of car, you have concept of vehicle, then you have a concept of coupe, right? Well, coupe is a kind of car is a kind of vehicle. These are hierarchically arranged. So if you look at the broader classification, one possible classification, the one may have more extensive one depending on the background knowledge you have about the vehicles. So vehicles can be two-wheelers or trucks. A two-wheeler can be a bicycle or a motorcycle, or and so on and so forth. Then it can be a car. If it's a car, it can be a sedan or a coupe or a convertible. If it's a truck, it can be a bus or a van or a tractor. Now, so there is the basic level of representation of organization. Then a level above it is called the superordinate level, super above. And the level below that is a subordinate level. Now, for any given level, there can be a superordinate and subordinate. For instance, for this level, this is a superordinate level. For this level, this is a superordinate level. But there is one level that is more commonly used. That is the basic level. For that level, the one that is superordinate and the one that is subordinate are slightly above and below the hierarchical level. Now, why basic level is important? Well, basic level of concepts is the concepts that's most commonly used. So for example, if I say, hey, can I get a ride, and say, hey, come on, I'll give you a ride in my vehicle. You don't say that, right? You just say car. Or you don't say, let me give you a ride in my coupe. You don't say that. You just say it's a car or a truck. So this is the most commonly used one. Just imagine if I asked you to give me a ride and you said, come on, let me give you a ride in your vehicle, and you take me to a chopper, right? It's weird, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that we use concept at a very basic level because the very basic level has information about these concepts sufficient for communication. Well, we started with the definition of thinking. We said that thinking involves the actual symbols or representations and how we manipulate them. Now, we talked about the different ways we represent symbols or the objects in the real world as symbols. Now, it's time to talk about different ways of manipulating these symbols or different ways of manipulating these representations. Well, stay tuned. We'll talk about manipulation of symbols in the next video.